right, we're up. And we are live. You are back. This is Jack Murphy. This is the Jack Murphy Live Show. This is Jack Murphy Live podcast number 53. Can you believe it, guys? 53 podcasts in. And today I have a special guest. His name is Michael Lind. Good to see you today, sir. How are you?
Thank you for having me.
Oh, great. Great to have you here. Michael Lind is the author of a book called The New Class War: Saving Democracy from the Managerial Elite. He is a prolific writer, a professor at the University of Texas, and we have a lot to talk about today, so we're just going to get right into it. When I first sort of had my political reawakening, let's say back in 2013, 2014, as sort of the racial tensions in America seemed to be ratcheting up, I kept thinking to myself, you know, the real issue today isn't race. Why is everybody talking about race? To me, the real issue was class. And it seems like after reading your work and reading your book, I think we might see that sort of the same way. So let's just start off with the general premise of the book, and then we can dig into it. One of the quotes very early on is that demagogic populism is the symptom, technocratic neoliberalism is the disease, and democratic pluralism is the cure. So that's the setting, Michael. Let's talk. I want to understand the class war that you wrote about in the book, and I do believe the audience is very interested in learning about this. So let's just get like a general summary of where we were there, and then we can dig into the details.
Well, in my book, The New Class War, I build on the idea of the managerial revolution, a term coined by James Burnham, who was a deputy of Trotsky, the communist in the United States, became a mentor and a founder of National Review and a conservative later in life. But the basic idea was that we've gone from a society of farmers and landlords to a society of wage earners, proletarians in the Marxist sense, that is the wage earning classes without property, and managers, which was Burnham's term, and I use it as well, sometimes managerial professional elite or overclass. And it's not simply managers in private corporations. It's also high-ranking bureaucrats in the government, in the nonprofit sector, in the media. And my argument in The New Class War is that the managerial elite is indeed a class. Not only is it somewhat hereditary on both sides of the Atlantic Ocean, and there are real parallels between the US and Europe in the way things are evolving, but also they have a common culture, common folkways, increasingly a common dialect. What is called wokeness or political correctness arguably is a kind of aristocratic dialect that serves to set off members of the insider club, members of the college credentialed elite from the working class, which doesn't know the latest word or the latest fashion. So my argument is that while racial tensions and racial prejudice obviously exist after 400 years of white supremacy in the U.S., they're diminishing by almost every index. And you don't just have to look at polls. If you look at intermarriage rates, that's the ultimate index of diminishing racial tensions, and they're going up for all groups, including African Americans. So the melting pot is bubbling away. In spite of what you hear in public, we're not fissuring along racial lines. Races are becoming blurred all the time through integration, assimilation, marriage. At the same time, we have in my view, widening and hardening class divide between the top 30% at most. The actual group within that, the managerial elite, is somewhat smaller. It's maybe 10 or 15% with the graduate professional degrees. So we're seeing a widening divide between those with diplomas and people whose education ends with high school or a couple of years of college or some vocational training of all races.
That's interesting to me to think about because I was reading in your book, there was a quote about Marx. And it was a discussion around the Irish folks sending their poor unemployed people to England, and they competing with the low-class English folks for jobs in the industrialized England there. And it was described as diversity was the sort of an essential component to keeping the capitalist class in power. And if you take that idea and combine it with these ideas that I've heard from James Lindsay and other folks about wokeism today being a false consciousness implanted in people as a way to distract them from the class struggle. It seems to jive with Marx's ideas back in industrial England. And then also sort of jives with my feeling that these racial tensions are somewhat fabricated today, or at least overstated in many cases, for the distinct, direct purpose of hiding the class war and protecting the elites. Do you think that that Marxist critique rings true today in 2021 America?
Well, I think some of the woke elite are sincere in their worldview, but there's no doubt it makes it more difficult to organize a sense of common solidarity among working class people if your media and your politicians are constantly harping on religious divisions and culture war. And this goes for the right as well as the left. I don't exempt, the kind of Karl Rove, Bush family right, because they tried doing this with people of faith and the religious right and so on. That was their own version of wokeness as part of what I think is as the effect, if not the intention, of being, as you say, a divide and rule strategy. And you use the term fabricated. I think this is something that we really need to introduce into public discourse. There are real, genuine communities. Okay, if you're like an Italian American community in the Bronx that's been there for several generations, that's a real community. Non-Hispanic white, which I presume you and I are assigned to by the government, this is a category. It's not a community, right? It includes Syrian Muslims, Norwegian Lutherans, right, and those Italian Americans in the Bronx. So one of the things I see happening is our elite, to some degree, they're exploiting the attenuation of actual communities, like that Italian American community in the Bronx. And then they want people to substitute these identities, which the government ultimately and the academics invent, sometimes out of thin air. For example, Asian and Pacific Islander, this is totally meaningless category. It includes Native Hawaiians, Chinese, Japanese, and South Asian Indians and Pakistanis, right? Did you know that our 5 racial categories that we find on the census in government forms, non-Hispanic white, Hispanic, Asian and Pacific Islander, African American, and Native American, these were invented by the Office of Management and Budget in the 1970s, right? So I think we have kind of a rather sinister Soviet-type nationality system, where instead of saying that thanks to the Civil Rights Revolution, which abolished apartheid in this country, we're all Americans, we're all citizens, we all belong to the same inclusive, pluralistic national community. Instead, there's an increasing tendency to emphasize that you belong to one of these artificial federal government-created races. And we see this particularly in the idea that African Americans, or for that matter, non-Hispanic white Americans, that category includes both citizens and immigrants, right? So, for example, if you look at Ivy League schools like Harvard, they use immigrants from Africa to boost their African American quota. So the message that they're sending, and that's true when they lump white Americans together with, Germans and Poles and Irish and Swedes, they're saying that your so-called race is more important than your American citizenship.
Yes, race has been elevated to a level that I'm not sure that it was even intended. I mean, there's a rise of a white consciousness. In my book, Democrat to Deplorable, I wrote a chapter, What is White Anyway? And I interviewed a guy who came through Ellis Island in the 60s who was Greek. And he said when he got here, there was there was two choices, white or black. So he put down white, and he's like, I've never thought of myself as white before in my life. I'm not from England. What do I have? What does that have to do with anything? And I was raised. No one told me I was like white. I was Irish, and I was
Non-Hispanic white.
right, and I was a Russian Jew. Like Ashkenazi. Like that was my identity. That was told to me by my parents. Not about being white. Now everybody non-Hispanic white. We're all white, and it's this divisiveness, but it's a distraction. It's a
Well,
distraction.
it's also, if I want to add to that, the other part of identity politics is gender and sexual organization or
Indeed.
orientation. And and again, I think we need to distinguish between categories and communities.
Mm.
If you're heterosexual or if you're gay, what do you have common with other people who share your sexual orientation? Nothing.
Yeah.
Nada. Zip.
Yeah.
It says a morally indifferent and politically empty a category as being left-handed or right-handed, right? Or being colorblind or something like that. Uh, so, I think what we see is the elite is trying to substitute these artificial categories, which are they're arbitrary. They were invented ultimately by somebody, and along with the traditions defining them, the flags, things like that. And the only reason this can succeed is that the actual communities, which are much more complicated in a country of nearly a third of a billion people, the actual communities are much smaller, right? They're much more granular. And the great promise of this country is you could be an American, part of a common American nation and citizenry, without having to give up your religion or your ethnicity or your but those were fairly small groups, a lot of the ethnic groups. I'm half Swedish Americans, a tiny group in the United States. But so what we're seeing is you're seeing the concept of a common American nation eroded, and the concept of these what are really real communities, right? It's the Navajo Nation as opposed to the Comanche Nation, in favor of these four or five or gender their different numbers, abstract categories. And I don't think you can separate that from a kind of clientelistic politics on the part of, if you remember when Joe Biden was interviewed by Charlemagne the God during the campaign.
What a
And
crazy
he said,
sentence.
if you vote for Trump, you ain't black. And I think that kind of sums it up. That is, particularly on the progressive side, but that was true of the Bush Rove people with the religious right. You ain't Christian if you vote for the Democrats. If you're Hispanic, you ain't Hispanic if you vote for Republicans. So I do think there's an element of elite manipulation of these categories for partisan purposes.
Definitely. I agree wholeheartedly. And as someone who was Gen X, I was raised to not see race, not see gender, be colorblind, do all the things that they asked me to do, gouge your eyes out, and now we're blind, and that's a problem. So the divisiveness is the common element. Whether they tell you to believe this thing or believe that thing or believe this other thing, the underlying theme is to divide you. Now, I wanted to actually drill down on something you said about the difference between categories and communities. And you said that the categories were diminishing. Well, let's just examine the directionality there. Do you think that the communities themselves were diminishing over time, or were they deliberately diminished and torn apart? Because from what I see at this extreme now end of the BLM sort of ideology and the CRT stuff, they want to dismantle all kinds of communities. They want to dismantle your family community,
Right.
your local community. They want to dismantle everything. It was this attenuation of the community, as you said, deliberate, accidental, ongoing. What's your take?
I think it was largely accidental. That is, if you look at this kind of woke ideology, it's actually very old. It goes back to the 60s and 70s and 80s under the term of political correctness. And it was confined to a few departments and a few university campuses and some bohemian subcultures. as long as you had healthy, flourishing grassroots communities. I think that globalization and industrialization and urbanization, all of these modern trends, have really weakened a lot of communities. The worst part was in the Midwest, and where you see the manufacturing sector was just ripped out by corporations, which transferred production offshore. And what was left was kind of bombed by subsidized Chinese imports. And there you get a real kind of collapse of community. But to some extent, it's happening with the working class majority across the country. And that's dangerous because it allows demagogic populists, but also demagogic centrists and liberals and conservatives to manipulate these lonely, alienated, isolated individuals. I mean, think about it. So you're all by yourself. You unmarried, have no partner, no children, living in an apartment. No job prospects. You get your information, through the internet or through mostly through the internet now, but maybe through radio and TV. You are a victim. You are a mark for any well-funded elite organization, be it the Democratic National Committee, the Republican Committee, that says, like, okay, you're our soldiers, you're our rent-a-mob, right? And one of the points I made after the Capitol violence on January 6th was, if you marry young and you have a family and you have home and property and so on, you're less likely to be swept up, right? Into these categorical causes and these partisan causes. Now, I'm not against partisanship, and that's the other theme of my book. We don't have real partisanship. We have pseudo-partisanship. We have street theater that looks like partisanship. Okay, real partisanship from the grassroots, to understand that, you have to go back 40 or 50 years to when the political parties were actually federations of local clubs. And you had political bosses, and they were powerful, but they answered to local people in Chicago or Austin or Idaho or wherever. Those have disintegrated. So what we call the parties are basically labels, which are competed for by groups of billionaire donors, politicians and their allies, and various economic and ideological interest groups. And then they need to pretend that there's this grassroots, support. So it's what's called AstroTurf. Remember, after the old Astrodome, the Astrodome, the fake plastic glass or grass.
Right.
So I think we're really in a bad situation. It's kind of like the late Roman Republic, where you have the nobles hire street mobs, right? To go after each other, whether it's Antifa or the Proud Boys or whatever.
Yeah. I've long argued that the Antifa and the Black Lives Matter folks, the casual observers riled to action on the street, are foot soldiers, ignorant foot soldiers, people that don't really know why they're doing what they're doing or what the motivations of the people who are controlling them or urging them into the streets, why they're really out there. And the optimist in me believes that if I could just talk to them long enough, they would understand why what they were doing is actually counterproductive to what they're interested in. But I don't think that's the case. But just one last note on this community bit. My professional life, personal life is filled with community. I've deliberately built an intentional community called the Liminal Order. And the idea here is that we've acknowledged what you're talking about and that these communities are falling apart. And when you're falling apart, you're weak and you're isolated and you can be manipulated and controlled. And so part of the way to sort of fight back against all of this is to start with yourself, fortify your family, fortify your community. And hopefully one day there'll be enough of these communities around that we can link up again together and sort of return to what the original principles were. There's so much to talk about of what you brought up, but I want to just move into some more details. We talked about the expansion. Well, we didn't yet, but we're talking about the expansion of the globalized market and the neoliberal approach. I've had both Matt Hammond, Matt Stoller and Sam Hammond on both populists, both talking about the effect of globalization and trade and the combination of the neoliberals and the union of basically the Republicans and the Democrats with the neoliberals into the corporate uniparty that we see now, which is very similar to the model that you've described. And this is one thing I want to just get your opinion on here is one of the fundamental tenets of globalism is the idea that everything needs to be able to move around, right? Capital, money, and people. And we expected that there would be this thing called labor mobility. And we would expect that there would be labor mobility not only internationally to go where the opportunities are, but domestically. That if your Midwestern town was destroyed through globalization and offshoring of manufacturing, that you would just pack up your family and drive to the new town and set up shop in the new economy or whatever. And we just didn't see that happen, right? And that's how you get the carving out. Labor mobility. Is this a real thing? Is this something that you can address? Is this something that we can put, the final sort of death blow to this idea that people get up and move around just whenever the jobs demand it?
Yeah, labor mobility is a myth, and I can prove it with two numbers. And the numbers are 3 and 18.
Okay.
So to start with number 3, according to the United Nations, only 3% of the human race lives in a country other than the one in which it was born. 3%. 90% of all people on Earth will live and die in the same country they're born in. Now, in countries with lots of immigrants, like the U.S., the number of foreign-born citizens goes up to 10, 15%. That still means 85% of Americans and Canadians and Europeans are born and will live and die in the U.S. or Canada or Europe. So we say America is a country of immigration. No, it's actually a country of natives, with about 15% being immigrant. Now, we're descendants of immigrants, all of us one way or the other. So the other number is 18. According to the New York Times, the average American, and they use women for this because women live longer, the average American lives 18 miles from her mother. Now, think about that. So whenever I have a college-educated audience, I ask them to raise their hands. Do you live 18 miles from your mother? No. No, college-educated professionals are nomads. I belong to that class. I belong to the managerial elite. We go wherever our careers take us. Most working-class Americans do not. There's an enormous number of working-class Americans, not only who live in the same state they were born in, but they live in the same city they were born in. Now, why does this matter for globalization? Well, there's an inherent class conflict. And the reason is very simple. Labor is geographically immobile, not only among nations, but among regions within a nation. Capital is mobile, right? The corporation can move the factory from the Midwest to South China. The Midwesterners cannot move to South China to get jobs, right? So you have a situation where naturally the working class majority is going to want restrictions on trade. It's also going to want some restrictions on immigration. You don't have to have zero immigration, but the attitudes towards immigration also fall along class lines. Those who see themselves as competitors with immigrants tend to be more opposed to it than those who see them as complements of immigrants or employers of immigrants. So we talk about this in these kind of abstract, academic theoretical terms, but at the end of the day, there is no scientific theoretical answer. It depends on, where you stand depends on where you sit. So, both the employers and the employees can agree that, unskilled immigration often lowers wages of unskilled workers. From the consumer's point of view, employer's point of view, that's good, right? More profits, lower prices. From the worker's point of view, that's bad. Well, who is right? Well, it depends on whose side you take.
Indeed it does. Indeed it does. So labor mobility is a myth. And in fact, when you incorporate globalization and labor mobility fails, it actually makes things worse for the people that you were ostensibly, allegedly, theoretically trying to benefit. And what you get is hollowed out of towns and communities where, in the vacuum that was once filled by industry and community, now is filled with fentanyl, drug addiction, homelessness, joblessness, poverty, and all kinds of things that we all collectively agree are a bad thing. Yet we basically made it happen inside the United States on purpose. And the reason that we did that is because the corporate uniparty that had fused with the neoliberals, as really well documented in Matt Stoller's book Goliath, they decided to engage in an arbitrage where they traded low wages for profits instead of seeking higher levels of productivity. What are the long-term ramifications of that profit generation through labor arbitrage versus productivity growth?
Well, that's the central question, because what made the U.S. and other industrial countries rich is not capitalism in general. It's industrial capitalism. That is, it is capitalists who invested in labor-saving, resource-conserving, energy-using technology so that you could use machines to do things that humans and animals had done in the past. There are all kinds of other capitalism. There's, there's condo flipping capitalism, right? There's dog race capitalism. There's flea market capitalism. The genius of industrial capitalism, and we should really say the industrial mixed economy, because the only successful industrial capitalist countries have a mixture of private sector dynamism, of a good state intervention where necessary, social safety net, and so on. But let's call it industrial capitalism. What that did was it created new wealth that did not exist before. And you have to have new wealth before you can share the wealth. So I'm very in favor of growth and industrial dynamism. If you have a kind of flea market capitalism, people are trading things back and forth, but nothing new is being created, right? If you have companies doing stock buybacks, the money, they're buying back their own stocks to boost the stock price. That is not going into laboratory research. It's not going into new production facilities. It's not doing anything that increases productivity. So there's a tendency to talk about this in terms of jobs. But at the end of the day, with the exception of financial panics, there has never been mass unemployment from new technology. Generally, banking crises cause mass unemployment temporarily. But new inventions don't. People find new jobs. New wealth is generated. The danger is that if you lose the dynamic industrial parts of your economy, then you become a completely unproductive economy, where, like many poor countries, we call them developing, but some of them are not developing. So you can have a country that has a flourishing tourism sector, flourishing natural resources, flourishing mining, flourishing banking and business sector in the cities, but it's going to be a poor country compared to one that has a dynamic, advanced manufacturing sector, even if the advanced manufacturing only employs a minority of people in the country.
Yes. Arbitrage, labor arbitrage, swapping out an expensive employee for a cheap one. That's like a drug. That's like taking a drug to boost your profits. It's not sustainable in the long run. And I imagine in the super ultra mega long run, once the whole world could get into this whole system, then finally they'd be forced into seeking out productivity to raise profits rather than labor arbitrage. But before we get to there, everybody in the world will have their own towns hollowed out. I went to George Mason University. I was trained as a libertarian economist. I have an economics degree from there. Then I went to Georgetown School of Foreign Service, where I got the globalist perspective. I later realized that it was actually combined, the neoliberal libertarian viewpoint combined with the globalist viewpoint. They called it the Washington consensus. They even called it the neoliberal consensus, without one hint of irony or one hint of it being like some bad thing. And so as I begin to really explore these issues with folks like yourself and others, experts in their field, I'm less inclined to believe that the libertarianism of my youth, the idealistic notion that we can just let everybody do their own thing, and strong, heavy bias towards private market solutions for problems, that's fading for me. It's fading for me, but it's not fading for everybody else out there. So, for example, we talked about how immigration drives down the wages of people in the United States. The libertarians will tell you that if you bring in immigration, you're going to drive up aggregate demand. And if you drive up aggregate demand, then you're going to actually benefit everybody else. Matt Iglesias wants to see 1 billion, Americans import all kinds of people. Alex Narestra, I can't pronounce his name, from the think tanks down here, constantly harping on libertarianism and immigration and open borders and whatnot. It makes me even think now about comparative advantage as well. So if you want to address Matt Iglesias, 1 billion people coming to the U.S. to drive up aggregate demand in order to spread the benefit to everyone, please do. I also want to talk about comparative advantage and if that's something that still lives today.
Well, let's start with the aggregate demand. It depends on what statistic you're trying to maximize. Overall GDP, gross domestic product, or per capita productivity. Okay, GDP, and this is where a lot of people make mistakes, even very intelligent people, as you know. GDP is it's actually hours, workforce hours, times labor productivity, right? That results in output. You can have absolutely stagnant productivity per worker and triple your GDP by tripling your population, right? So, yeah, it's true. The U.S. could have a vastly greater GDP if we imported 1 billion people. Why stop there? Why not 3 billion? Why not 5 billion? GDP would be bigger. If you want to increase productivity per capita, that's a totally different question. Now, it may be compatible with population growth, but ultimately, what you need to increase productivity per capita is for there to be strong incentives for employers and industry to engage in labor-saving innovation. Innovation, so you produce the same output with fewer workers working fewer hours, can either take the form of new technology, right? So like you have a robot assembly line with one person, George Jetson, instead of more primitive technology with 50 factory workers. Mm-hmm. So it can take the form of mechanization and automation. In some cases, productivity growth takes the form of new, more efficient business models. And sometimes they're combined, so like Amazon and home package delivery. So it's both a new business model, but it was enabled by a new technology, the internet. So the problem is many of our politicians do not understand the distinction, just as they don't understand the distinction between industrial capitalism, which is productive, and all sorts of unproductive parasitic capitalism. Let me give you an example. This is a colorful example. Mm-hmm. I used to work for a magazine, and my editor quit to join a startup. And I thought, that's cool, right? Like going into tech, doing a startup. So the so-called tech startup was actually a website where they allowed people to upload videos of their cute pets. And their money-making model was, Jared Lanier talks about this, Jared Lanier, the tech critic. They would then sell advertising revenues. And the people with the website would keep all the advertising revenue. They had not done any work. The cute little kittens, the cute little puppies, they got no money at all. The grandma and grandpa putting them up there. It was literally a parasitic form of capitalism where the capitalists, they provided this forum, and then they just took 100% of the profit while other people were doing labor. And also, it was very low tech. It was using 2000s technology. So, one of the things that I like to ridicule is the spread of the term startup from what originally were, productive, large scale, innovative computer manufacturing, for example. Then it migrated to software, which is still increases productivity. Now, any new business is a startup, right? If you open a flea market on the corner, that's a startup, right?
That is interesting to think about. Definitely parasitic, but also competed away, right? Like eventually that model got competed away, and now the content creation and advertisement union it does have revenue sharing. There's a lot to that, and we see more and more of that. Actually, there's more hosting services that combine revenue sharing in order to get those incentives aligned. But the early movers, for sure, had an opportunity to capture from people. It makes me think also, though, if you remember America's Funniest Home Videos, very similar, right? They just captured all these people's VCR tapes, put them on TV, sold advertising, kept all the money. Pretty much the same model, just delivered across a different pipe. So there wasn't really any innovation.
But what happens to your pipeline for engineers and scientists?
Right.
When, as there was a story the other day, that American kids want to be YouTube influencers. Chinese kids want to be astronauts, right? And I'm all in favor of both, right? But I am glad that at least some of our so-called tech billionaires like Elon Musk and Jeff Bezos, for all of the criticism I would have on some things, they're building rockets, right? It's not just apps.
Right. No, they're certainly building things. Elon Musk is putting himself in position to basically dominate the universe. He's going to blanket the earth with high-speed internet that no one else will be able to put up because he's also the only one that owns the rockets that put him up into space. So watch out for the grand new robber barons of space, Elon Musk, coming at you. But in some ways, though, I mean, look, he's going to solve a problem, labor mobility problem, because now labor mobility will become actually less of a thing as long as you can bring the jobs to where you live, right? And with all of this virtual work, stay at home work, the pandemic is going to be huge for this type of transition. People can now work in places where they weren't able to work before. And I think that that's actually going to be a very good thing for America in general. The more that we can get people out of the cities and into the heartland with slower rhythms of life and re-engage with the vibrations of the earth and the universe and nature, I think that's going to have a healing effect on people. Actually, the cities are so.
Yeah, but you're gonna have a fight.
Yeah.
With a lot of corporate elites and media elites and so on. There was a movement in the 1940s and 50s to decentralize publishing. Because they're like, why would you do it downtown Manhattan? That was expensive even then, right? So you remember, I think it was Doubleday. You would see Garden City, New York. Like they moved to a garden city. It was this edge city. And what happened was the publishing nabobs and moguls, they wanted a big downtown office in Manhattan to show off.
Yeah.
Right? So they had to have their own skyscraper. And everyone in the company had to, even if they had to live way out in the boondocks, they had to travel in there to be their entourage. So one of the things we see is that a lot of the corporate hierarchy in the U.S., and I've spent most of my life, in adult life, in Washington and New York. Part of it is about the social networking of the owners and the managers and the CEOs where they want to be. It's not where it would be efficient, right, in order to do the actual activities of the firm.
Yeah. I used to work in real estate development, and we did some recruiting of corporations to big land development projects we were doing. And in doing our research, we found that the number one driving force for corporate headquarters is just where the CEO wants to live.
Exactly.
It has nothing else to do with that. But if you look at the new phenomenon of smaller work, gig work is a bad word for it. I like to call that the hunter-gatherer sort of approach. Kill what you eat, get out there, make it happen for you. You can work and live in a number of different places now with that don't require that concentration. But then again, The concentration of the firms in Silicon Valley and elsewhere led to positive spillovers and innovation effects that we may not see if everything becomes dispersed. Certainly something to see play out into the future. Let's talk about comparative advantage. This is one of those things that's like the bedrock component to free trade and economic liberalism is like, hey, if you got do something better than somebody else, just keep doing that thing over and over again and you'll get rich, right? Is comparative advantage still a real thing? Is it something that we should pay attention to, or is that another one that might, belong on the dust, the
Well,
heaps of
the
history?
economists, as you know, will say you have to distinguish absolute advantage from comparative advantage. The comparative advantage, you can do both things better than I can, but the ones that you can do best, you should do 100%. And then even though I'm not as good at you on the other thing, then I should do that 100%. It's total nonsense. I mean, from a historical perspective, there is no natural comparative advantage in an industrial society. There's absolute advantage. Make ice cubes. You have an advantage if you're in Antarctica, but you can even make ice cubes in the Sahara Desert if you have industrial technology. What industrialism means is you can pretty much make anything anywhere as long as you can get a few rare inputs, like rare earths in iPhones. It doesn't matter where it's located. And the other problem with comparative advantage is the premise is the world gets richer through specialization. And by richer, it means consumers are better off. Well, this in the real world, in the world of neoclassical economics, only individuals exist. There are no countries,
Mm.
right? There are no nation states, blocs, alliances, and empires. In the world we live in, the nation state is an economic actor. It is competing for shares of global industry with other nation states. Often it's military rivals. So what that means is in any given era, in the 2020s, the 1930s, the 1800s, there are going to be some strategic industries which are necessary for military power if you're going to be a great power. If you're a small, poor country, you're at the mercy of the victims. Okay, so I'm only talking about the great powers. But if you want to be a self-sufficient, great military power, you're going to have steel. You're going to have iron. In the future, you're going to have AI. You may have new kinds of materials and quantum computing. And instead of having specialization, you're going to get redundancy because every single great power in the world is going to want an automobile industry. It's going to want a computer industry. It's going to want an aerospace industry. And the economists will tell you, well, this is a waste. They should specialize. You know, the U.S. should own mufflers, and then Europe should only make wheels and chassis, and then the Chinese should put them together. The problem is the U.S. is in a low-level Cold War with China at the moment. We've had very few periods of prolonged great power peace in history. So, if you start with an economic ideology that says, well, let's assume perpetual world peace and no nation states, that's like starting your defense strategy by saying, okay, let's assume there are no countries and there will never be wars. What kind of military do we need?
Right. Flawed from the beginning. And so let's just take this one last step further. You are known for dismantling libertarianism. I think you've written about it quite a bit. Let's put the final nail in the coffin for libertarianism, because I know that there's a lot of guys that follow me and listen that still hang on, still claim, still believe they're libertarian, maybe get it confused with just the notion of personal independence or personal liberty. Is libertarianism dead? This is something we've been talking about on various shows, including Tim Pool's lately. What do you say, sir?
I don't know if it's dead. It is changing parties. It is leaving the Republican Party, which, as it's become a more working class downscale party, tends, for obvious reasons, to want the state at least to protect the working class from foreign mercantilist regimes, like China, for wage suppressing immigration. What you see is that the Democratic Party is becoming more libertarian. So, for example, I saw the other day support for free trade has never been higher among Democrats. As you remember, all the way up until 2000 or so, you had people like Dick Gephardt, the protectionists were Democrats.
Right.
It
Right.
was the Republicans, the Bush Republicans, who were. So this just goes back to class. That is, if you belong to the elite and you want to invest money in stocks and bonds around the world, and you derive income from multinational corporation, or your law firm or insurance firm works for global multinationals, then you're going to be in favor of globalization, right? If you're a factory worker, if you're a furniture maker in North Carolina, and you're getting wiped out by subsidized Chinese products, you're going to be against it. So again, where you stand depends on where you sit.
And so somehow the Democrats have become both the party of immigrants, the party of globalization, the party of the elites. But that's not how I really remember them, right? Like, this is a new development, isn't it?
Yeah, the irony is now the Democrats have already gotten rid of Andrew Jackson, right, and Thomas Jefferson. They got rid of their Jackson Jefferson Day dinners, which were their annual dinners.
Oh,
I think
interesting.
FDR will be kicked out next because if you look at today's Democrats, they are really the descendants of the liberal Republicans of the 1950s and 60s. And the key issues of John Lindsay, of Nelson Rockefeller, these liberal Republicans, the old Ripon Society Republicans, not the Goldwater Reagan Republicans, but the liberal Republicans. They were environmentalism. They were, in those days, it was Planned Parenthood. Now it's abortion rights, it's gender fluidity, it's all kinds. But you see the parallel there, right? And it was civil rights because remember the liberal Republicans, going back to Lincoln, were more supportive of civil rights legislation and anti-segregation than the Southern Democrats, the segregationist Dixiecrats. So I see the Democratic Party today is basically the liberal country club Republicans of, say, 1970 or 1980, with a kind of university campus left wing, and they have absolutely nothing whatsoever to do with any of the other Democrats before the 60s and 70s. Conversely, the Republicans, with Trump and post-Trump, look a lot more like the old Dick Gephardt, Jim Webb Democrats than they do like the Republicans of John Connally or George Herbert Walker Bush, the old employer, old money Republicans. So I think we're seeing we're stuck with two parties because of our first past the post plurality electoral system, where a third party vote tends to be wasted. So we're going to have two parties. But we've seen this weird phenomenon where you can make the case that the Republicans are actually the former Democrats today. And the Democrats of the 2020s are really the moderate Republicans of the 70s and 80s.
Well, indeed. And for somebody like myself who's written a book called Democrat to Deplorable, I have documented the personal struggle and journey it is to go from somebody who grew up a Democrat, woke up in 2020, looks around and is like, this is not my people anymore. This is not what I was raised on. This is not what I believed in. And there was to me, it seemed like a very sudden shift. And I know it's been gradual and it's structural in nature. But as for someone who was a casual observer and became a professional observer, the switch felt very very fast and was bewildering.
It's kind of like Hemingway's joke. How do you go bankrupt?
Yeah.
Slowly and then very fast.
Yeah, exactly.
So you can go all the way back to 1972, and you see the first glimmerings of Democratic parties, this coalition of upscale college-educated professionals and minorities voting as blocs. But you're right. There was a massive, well-documented shift to the left among college-educated whites after 2010. This is before Trump. It's not a result of Trump.
No.
And Zach Goldberg
Yep.
on his Twitter feed has documented this. And at this point, the college-educated, professional class white left is way to the left on cultural issues, not economics. Way to the left of everybody else, not only in the country, but in the Democratic Party. Hispanic and African-American Democrats are much more moderate and conservative than the white upscale Democrats are now
Yeah.
on these social issues.
But yet, you don't vote for Biden, you ain't black. When is when is that? So this is okay. This is why this deliberate false consciousness of the race war and the conflict is meant to distract people from exactly what we've described here. How can the Democrats be at once the neoliberal globalist immigration folks, also supposed to be pro working minorities? Like, how does that square? There's just an inherent contradiction there. When will that reveal itself? How can we force that to the surface so that people will actually understand the illogic and the counterproductivity contained within that coalition?
Well, there are contradictions on both sides. In the Republican Party, you do have a tension between small business owners, who are very important, and the working class, which wants higher wages, which small business owners have trouble paying because of their profit margin. So there are tensions, but the tensions are much more extreme on the Democratic side. I like to say the Democrats are the party of Hollywood millionaires and their maids. Now, you wouldn't ordinarily think the maid and the millionaire would be in the same party, right? And the millionaires have to persuade the maids that they are protecting them from these evil people out to get them. And I don't think this is going to sell in the long run for a couple of reasons. One is that a majority of non-white Americans, African Americans, Hispanics, Asian Americans, I don't like these terms, they're not granular, but I have to use them,
Right.
Are now working class people in the suburbs. So this whole idea of the urban poor is 50 years out of date.
Mm-hmm.
Most Americans of all races are working class suburbanites. Most of the actual residential and job growth is in the exurbs. It's beyond the suburbs. It's out in the boondocks where it's cheap, right? And immigrants who come to the U.S., they may live in the downtown big cities for a generation, but they don't want to be maids in Beverly Hills. They don't want their family to do that for the next 1,000 years, right? If they can't do it, they want their kids to go be in the suburbs and, own a house and have a car and a dog, right? So I think this kind of hourglass coalition of the Democrats is very shaky. And you see this in the last 3 elections, contrary to all the talk about how the Republicans are losing everyone except white nationalists. They picked up African American and Hispanic votes more and more in every. So you see what David Shore, a Democratic analyst, has called racial depolarization and class polarization.
Racial depolarization in the age of Trump. That's not a headline we're about to see anywhere, is it? But it's true. It is true, especially the border counties in Texas, which I'm sure you're very well aware of. If you look at that New York Times election map where it shows the arrows and the change, you can see there's these huge arrows that come from Texas, and they basically like point all the way over to California because there's been so much of a shift in the electorate there, as well in southern Florida. It's interesting to me. I just had a thought while we were talking there that as the immigrants get richer, they're going to have more to conserve. They're going to be more interested in tax issues and small business issues and such. And you would just grow out of a party that wants to keep you poor. The millionaire and the maids, that is a really wonderful framing. I'm gonna use that if you don't mind, sir.
Oh, please. And let's not forget the young people. There was a fellow named Fred Hampton who was one of Bobby Kennedy's aides, wrote a book back in the 70s predicting that the Democrats would have a permanent electoral majority because of the students. Well, guess what? The students grew up, they got jobs, they moved to the suburbs, then they started paying property taxes.
Right.
And they voted for Reagan. a lot of the boomer generation once the taxes hit. Yeah. So I think, again, contrary to this misleading elite narrative of increasing racial polarization, and it's fed to some degree on the right. There are people on the right who argue that Latin American immigrants are unassimilable, they're different. This is not true. This is not what we see happening. Immigrants from Mexico and Central America, Latin America. Now, whether they can get up economically or not depends on the economy, obviously. But they are assimilating, learning English, marrying into other groups at exactly the same rate. if not faster than the Germans and the Irish and the Italians and the Poles did in the past. So the melting pot is just bubbling away. That doesn't fit the narrative of increasing racial division, but it's true. We're getting more, interracial marriages and mixed race people all the time.
Yeah. Yeah. Again, return to the false consciousness, the false idea that there's a huge oppressive race war underway. Again, meant to distract from the economic circumstances that are continuing to benefit the elite managerial class. Resulting in additional polarization and de-racial polarization in the age of Trump, which is a fascinating concept. So just once and for all, libertarianism, you say, has migrated out of the maybe Republican Party into the Democratic Party in the service of global labor arbitrage, right? So it's not even about freedom; it's just about money.
So it's very selective libertarianism that the Democrats are picking up. So in terms of trade, of global labor arbitrage, immigration, sure. In terms of letting Trump voters, have Twitter accounts and be on Parler and so on, no. Right? I mean, not a week goes by. And my own background is I've never been a registered Republican. I was either a Democrat or an independent. But I'm like you. This is not the Democratic Party I grew up in, where they're calling on private corporations to censor people of the other party, which is it's scarier in a way than just, like calling on the FBI to arrest the other party, right? Because it's devious and it's indirect. So clearly that's not libertarian. If you look at the ACLU, the American Civil Liberties Union, I would call it the FACLU, the former American Civil Liberties Union. It's simply a wing now.
Yeah.
Of the woke wing of the Democratic Party. So we do. And even if you're a Democrat, I think you should be worried about this. That is, you have a single wing of a single party which controls most of the institutions of American society, other than the government, right? Increasingly, it's the banks, the corporations, the big corporations, the media. The universities are 95, almost 100%. Democratic in terms of the faculties and the staff. So at this point in history, it is only elected politicians who are not part of this single monoculture, and that's why I think particularly the Republicans, they're doing this slowly but surely. They're going to have to rethink their aversion to state power.
Yes,
because the only institution that they have some influence in is the government. They've lost the corporations, they've lost the banks, they've lost the media. And if you have the old libertarians and the anti-statists like Grover Norquist saying, well, let's shrink government, to make it small enough to drown in a bathtub, well, Jack Dorsey on Twitter is going to be very happy with that, right? They're just going to substitute their own private corporate government, right, with one view, shared by everybody in the private sector, the media sector, academic and nonprofit sectors.
Indeed. And in fact, the government has outsourced its dirty work to private corporations in many ways. Silence these people, prohibit their banking. Let's see with these vaccine passports. Now you can't travel. All decide, hey, it's private corporations, they can just decide whatever they want to do, It's been interesting to me. I remember a couple of years ago, the folks at Reason, the Libertarian mag, I think they called some of my buddies MAGA socialists. And the criticism, it was meant to be a criticism. I kind of laugh at it because it's actually a little bit accurate in that what you said is perfectly relevant here. The Republicans and the right, the MAGA folks, the populists, they need to, like you said, reduce their aversion to government influence because right now the government seems to be the only thing that could protect us. But at the same time, I'm less sanguine about the Republicans having power over the extended bureaucratic apparatus and maybe some of the elected officials. But even Joe Biden and all those guys, they're beholden to the woke left. First thing they did in office, all those executive orders, all smelling like wokeism for sure.
Well, I don't want to be suggesting that we should trust Republican politicians either. In my book, The New Class War, I stress
Yes.
And you were talking about this with your own communities of choice. The only asset, the only resource that the working class majority has is its numbers. As individuals, they don't have influence, they don't have old school ties, they don't have money, don't make big donations, don't have celebrity, and they can get nothing done unless they are organized. Now, the forms of organization differ. You had the Grange for the populists and the Farmers Alliance. You had the trade unions for the industrial workers. You had the churches for the civil rights movement. So, but at the end of the day, put not your faith in princes. You can't trust politicians, even the ones who are accountable to you after a few years. You have to have your own mass-based organizations that exist between elections that can bring pressure on the politicians. Otherwise, the politicians pay attention to you a few weeks before the election and then just talk to the lobbyists the rest of the time.
Yeah, I wonder if Black Lives Matter is going to get that sense in the next 3 years. I thought that they might, in terms of the election year summer mayhem that was riled up, but it seems that they still have influence. So that troubles me in thinking that the woke takeover of all of the institutions is complete, including the government. And I'm not sure exactly how that's going to play out. But the intentional communities of choice, building them to be robust, combining the power of technology and high-speed internet and the info economy, you can actually build communities in which you can live, work, play, marry your sons and daughters, create your own customs, norms, mythology, recreate, socialize. You can live a whole life with an independent, intentional community or network, as I describe it today. And hopefully one day, that pastiche, I don't know if that's the right word, I haven't used that word in a long time, of all of these communities one day could glom together finally into something that will be able to resist what's happening here. But it is a long-term project. There's no question about that, and there's certainly no quick fixes. We've described pretty well in detail, I think, the sort of tyranny of this managerial class, the way that they've gutted America for profits. They've traded profits. Not only they traded away communities and culture and human lives and life expectancy and basically death. They've accepted death of people in order to chase profits instead of productivity, and it's just created a disaster at national security levels. We saw with the pandemic, certainly that exacerbated some things and showed some of the weaknesses that we have with everything being completely offshored. But what are we going to do next? What is coming next? What can we expect? In your book, New Class War, Saving Democracy from the Managerial Elite, you laid out a few different options. I think one was described as renationalization, another one described as neoliberalism plus. There was developmentalism and rentism as options. What you wrote the book, I probably wrote it a couple of years ago by now, given how long the timeline is on these things.
I still remember
it. Sometimes I make the mistake. I'm like, I just read your book 50 times, and I'm like, do you remember what you said on page 96, sir? They're like, no, buddy, I really don't. But has your view, describe these potential outcomes? Has your view updated? What do you see? Where are we going? What can people expect?
Well, I think to some degree it's been confirmed since I wrote the book, because the most important trend is, as I said, it's racial depolarization. Because Ezra Klein, who's a nice guy, we had a good conversation on his show. He came out with a book around the same time saying the opposite.
Yeah.
Saying that Republicans are all white nationalism. They're going to keep losing minority votes. And I thought, no, I think you're going to see more and more working class minority voters alienated from the Democrats the way they're going. And I was right about that. By rentism, I mean an economy where you live off of interest, or you live off of intellectual property rights, royalties, and so on, which are all perfectly fine things within reason. But unless you're actually investing and inventing new technologies and actually making things in your country, not just inventing it and then leasing it for somebody in another country to make, unless you're building up your own military industrial base, you're going to fall behind. And I think what will ultimately save the country is geopolitical rivalry. I mean, we don't want to have wars. certainly not hot wars, and cold wars are very costly too. But we do live in a world of conflicting rival great powers. It's just built into the nature of world politics. And if you fall behind at some point, there's going to be two parties within your country. One party is going to say, we have to catch up and rebuild. And the other party is going to say, well, let's just appease the other guys. And we'll just be content with being second or third rate. And it's a battle. And sometimes the wrong side loses. If you look at Britain in the 1900s, there was a group that was just absolutely freaking out about the rise of American and German industrial power. They wanted to protect British markets, invest in technology, train British workers, and they lost. They lost to the bankers in the City of London. And consequently, Britain today has lost almost all of its industry. They are good at vaccines. They do have a good medical pharmacy. Mm-hmm. Their automobile industry is transplants from Japan and South Korea. They have heritage parks and, PBS shows and so on. But they went into decline, and they would have been defeated by the Germans if the U.S. had not bailed them out. And we're now in a rivalry with China, which still has a way to go to catch up. But if the Chinese have about 1/4 of our per capita GDP, if they had caught up to us in per capita GDP, they would have 4 times the size of our economy, right? That we've never faced anything like this. In the world wars, Germany had about 1/3 of the U.S. economy. The Soviet Union as a whole matched U.S. GDP, but that was a lot of Muslim republics and, Estonia and Lithuania and so on. We have never faced a rival which, like us, is a continental nation state with a largely homogeneous population, one language, efficient government. And I think that's the big dispute of our time. And the good news is the party that will want to rebuild America, hold it. So not to defeat China. We're not going to defeat, China in the way we defeated the Soviets or the Germans, where they just disappear from history, but to coexist on terms favorable to us. In order to have that national development program, we have to enlist working people because they are the resources that we need. We need their brains. We need their muscles. We can't treat them as this group of disposable people whom we use redistribution to keep them from dying, right? While the real work is inventing apps in the Bay Area, right? Or coming up with new financial projects and products.
Before the show, we were talking about import substitution industrialization. I went to school, I told you, at the Georgetown School of Foreign Service, where I learned my focus area was on Latin America. So I studied quite a bit about import substitution industrialization. It is where you erect trade barriers so to keep out foreign products so that you can develop your internal domestic industries. And people that taught me this, the neoliberal consensus, Washington consensus, globalist folks at Georgetown told me that this was an abject failure and that there was no way that import substitution industrialization could work. But yet in the pre-show, we did talk a little bit about how the United States and Germany and other countries have used import substitution industrialization as a way to actually grow their domestic manufacturing industrial capabilities. Is that something that we're going to need to return to, a targeted industrial policy that has strategic interests at mind, which are above GDP growth, which are above becoming the richest country for some people in America?
Yeah, I think it is, and there are encouraging signs there because the Biden administration, in its manufacturing policies, at least so far, is continuing a lot of the emphasis of the Trump administration. There hasn't been a big break. There's a break in a lot of other areas, but the Biden administration policymakers really seem serious about reshoring a lot of critical supply chains that have been lost to China. And they do see China as an economic as well as a military rival. There are other differences between the left and the right, but this is becoming an area of consensus. And the other thing is you don't need to have indiscriminate protectionism. We didn't even have indiscriminate protectionism in the 19th century when the U.S. was the most protectionist country in the world, becoming the most successful industrial nation in the world. We had low tariffs or no tariffs on inputs to manufacturing, so like raw materials, potassium from guano in South America. Yeah, sure, let it in, right? It lowers the cost for business. But on the other hand, we kept out British steel to build up our own steel industry. So the rational trade policy is neither protection nor free trade. It's strategic trade. That is, depending on the industry and the good in question, you may want free trade. You may want all out 100% protection if it's something absolutely essential for your military. If you're trading with allies who are not military threats, you may want reciprocal trade. So, for example, we have fairly balanced trade with the European Union. We sell cars in their markets, they sell cars in our markets. We're military allies. The Europeans are not trying to wipe out our industries the way the Chinese government is targeting industries. So it's a mix. It's a mix of free trade, protectionism, and reciprocity on a sector by sector basis.
When I hear the word strategic policymaking, it makes me think that the benefits are less obvious, less tangible to regular folks, let's say. Because to me, when we think of strategic, it's sort of like long term and for everybody and for the greater good. It's not as tactical or immediate of a return. It's something that may even involve a little bit of sacrifice in order to achieve your strategic goals. How do you rally a nation around a strategic goal that may not have immediate returns to specific individuals or classes or categories inside the U.S. when we're working towards something that might take 10, 15, 20, 30 years to achieve? What is the animating force that supports strategic policymaking like that?
Well, the animating force is designing the policy in such a way that you create groups within your country that are interested, that will benefit from it, that will profit from it. This is horrifying to libertarians, but it's basic politics. I teach this in a class on the politics of public policy at the LBJ School, the University of Texas. You want to create a coalition of voters and of lobbies, which will allow you to enact your long-term policy, but they will also be there to defend it when your political rivals just try to repeal it again and again and again. We saw that with the Affordable Care Act. The Obama administration ultimately won. They had created enough winners through the Affordable Care Act of people, who could get insurance without pre-existing conditions and so on. Whatever you think of the merits, politically it was a success. And Republicans who tried to repeal it again and again, they just didn't have enough votes and enough popular support. So I think there are ways, if you want to reshore critical supply chains, for example, then the thing to do politically is to spread those supply chains and those suppliers through the country, revitalize lots of communities around the country. And then that creates people in those communities, they have a stake in those supply chains. And there will be a virtuous circle. This was one of the problems, by the way, with globalization. I remember I took part in meetings both pro and anti-NAFTA. I was kind of a double agent in the 1990s. It was kind of fun in my youth. The reason NAFTA passed and the reason a lot of these global trade treaties passed is because for historical reasons, manufacturing in the U.S. was concentrated in the Northeast and in the Midwest, the Great Lakes region, the so-called Rust Belt. So there are only a few states where manufacturing had a big electoral importance. Every single state has farmers. Every state has farmers. And first the Japanese in the 90s, then the South Koreans, then the Chinese government. I'm talking about the governments, not the people. They figured out, right? Whenever the U.S. wants to crack down on their mercantilist policies hurting American manufacturing, they send a trade delegation to the potato growers in Iowa, and they say, "Oh, China, we'll buy more potatoes, we'll buy more soybeans, and so on." So there are ways, and this is why politics is not a science, right? You not only have to get the right policy, but you have to design it in such a way that you can create a coalition that will support your policy even when you've been voted out of office.
It seems to me that that might be a few years away yet here in the United States. I think we're inching our way towards it. I think the structural forces at work will demand the sort of the inevitable conclusion of all these factors that we've talked about is going to just sort of reveal the rawness of our circumstances in such a way that people will be motivated to action. What do you think is going to happen yourself, sir? Prognosticate for us in the next 5 to 10 years. What policies are going to come? What policies are going to go? What is the trend going to be? What would you do if you were in charge and could wave a magic wand? We're going to use this as a way to sort of wrap this up and bring us on out here.
Well, when William F. Buckley Jr. ran for mayor of New York, he was asked what his first act would be as mayor if he were elected, and he said, "Abdicate." So I'm not sure I'm fit to run the country. I think in the rest of the decade, we're going to see the continued decay of the neoliberal model. The forces for really drastic action are not there yet, and they will try to keep patching it together. And as I say, things are going in the right direction. The things that the Biden administration is saying about trade now, the Obama and Clinton administration would have said about reshoring supply chains. But on the other hand, the money, the power, the vested interest, these all have to go. So I think things will get worse before they get better. And on the other hand, the U.S. may not have a happy ending. There may not be a happy ending. In the book I warn about, I've warned in the past about Brazilianization. Brazil's a beautiful country. I visit it frequently. It's a wonderful place, wonderful people. But they just a bad system and bad historic decisions. And the U.S. can end up as a post-industrial resource colony of industrial Europe and industrial Asia. And lots of people make a lot of money selling soybeans, to the industrial nations of Asia, having, welcoming their tourists, right? Selling movies to the Asian market. I mean, that's possible. In the European market as well. So I think, we're getting back. It's going to be the major geoeconomic debate in America. It's, do we rebuild ourselves as a great industrial power? Or do we simply accept that we're going to specialize in financial services, in professional services, and in commodities, and in tourism and real estate? And I don't know which side will win, honestly.
Bleak. That's bleak. An inverse of colonialism. Well, actually, I mean, first of all, the United States colonies were literal resource colonies for the English monarchy and the empire. But eventually, we became the colonizers and the resource extractors from all around the world. And it would be a fascinating historical turn of events for that to become re-inverted yet again. And what a bleak notion. A country relegated to financial products, app creation, commodities, and real estate. I think that's pretty much where we are right now, honestly. Like nothing else is really jumping to mind. Culture.
Yeah, that's right.
Even.
So I think the reindustrialization of the U.S. is going to be led by the government, the military in particular, the national security sector, where they will say, okay, capitalists, you don't want to invest in rare earth mines, then the government will do it. Or we will subsidize you to do it. I mean, there may be public-private partnerships. And that's how, we're not taught the correct American economic history. First bills that President George Washington signed on assuming office was bill creating federal arsenals. The United States military had socialist military factories from the 1780s and 90s up until World War II. The Navy made its own ships. The Army made its own weapons. They sometimes in wartime they added on private contractors. But I think we may come to that. That is, if the global capitalists don't want to invest in any manufacturing in the U.S. and the federal government thinks it's a necessity, well, we've been there before, right? The government can do it.
I asked you about the animating force before. You said incentives, which is a very good, clean textbook answer. No offense. I worry that the animating force will have to be some level of militarism, some level of antagonism, something to motivate people to understand what you're talking about here. It's a national security issue. We can't defend ourselves. Why does it matter? We don't have any enemies. Yes, we do. These are our enemies and they're coming to get us. Therefore, we have to build our factories and build everything, reshore stuff here. That is a reasonable scenario to describe, no?
Yeah, but I think I'm a realist. So, my own view is that you have to worry about the potential of other countries, not just their motives. It's not a matter of demonizing, right? So, the United States since 1789, we have fought wars with Britain, France, Germany, indirectly with Russia, directly with China and Korea, Japan, Mexico,
Right.
Canada. So today's ally can be tomorrow's enemy, and that's realpolitik. That's realism 101. That is, even if the only two countries in the world, let's say China collapsed, right? All these other countries collapsed, and it was the European Union and the U.S. And we're democratic and we're liberal and we're friendly and we have good trading relations. I guarantee you that the strategists in both countries are going to say, well, the Europeans are going to say, well, the Americans are friendly now, but what about the future? So I agree that you don't want nativistic, bigoted, xenophobic, campaigns of hatred whipped up, for domestic reasons, even if it's good ones, reindustrialization. But I see this as a precautionary. That is, you have to constantly be at the global frontier in military relevant technology, because you even if it seems for a decade or two that we're entering this period of world peace, as we saw, right, the great peaceful age of globalization that began in the 90s had ended pretty much by 2008 when Russia fought the Chechen War in the Ossetian War, and China shot down its own satellite, which was a big deal in 2008. It was sending a signal to the U.S., right? And then did things deteriorate after that? So that was like a little brief blip of maybe 20 years of this everlasting world peace. So it's not a matter of being nativistic or nationalistic. It's a matter of just taking reasonable precautions.
The Pax Americana lasted, what, 12 years, 15 years?
Something like that.
Barely.
Almost as long as the Third Reich.
And on that note, folks, we're out. It is sort of sad to think that, because being Gen Xer and whatnot, I graduated high school in 94. I remember the fall of the Berlin Wall very vividly. I remember the feeling of the 90s, everybody getting rich from tech and all that, and then 9/11. So it was from 91 to 2001. It felt like 10 years of just everybody going to get rich, everybody happy. The world is great. There's no problems anywhere. Music was fun. Drugs were fun. The whole world was having a blast. And then, back to reality. So that is the reality. You said something that's going to stick with me, that the great power peace times are awfully short in historic terms, something to consider. And, some of these things are not exactly uplifting, but it is important for us to address these issues and to get them out into the forefront and to begin raising awareness around what you described as, the strategic policy making that's going to protect us in the long run. And I think that this is part of our just cultural problem in general, is just getting people focused, taking their focus away from the next notification on Twitter and to thinking about 20 and 30 years worth of effort that we need in order to combat 50 years of decay. So we're doing that one brick at a time. Mr. Lynn, thank you so much for coming on. I really appreciate it. Michael Lynn, the author of The New Class War, Saving Democracy from the Managerial Elite. Go out and get that right away. Is there anywhere else that you'd like to point people to, sir, where they can find your work or connect with you online, perhaps?
They can, I have an email at the University of Texas, they can find at the Lyndon B. Johnson School.
They can find that.
And I'm a columnist for Tablet Magazine, and I write frequently for American Compass. So Tablet Magazine and American Compass highlights most of my work.
Fantastic. Seek it out, guys. Read the book. It is filled with historic evidence and good stories, and it's very well written and compelling. I read it, and I knew that I had to talk to you. So thank you very much for coming on the show. Guys, I'm Jack Murphy. This is Jack Murphy Live. This has been podcast number 53. We got a lot of great stuff coming. Subscribe to the channel here on YouTube. Hit the like button. Share it with your friends. It is the best way for us to spread the word. The comments are always filled with people saying, hey, we need more people here. Hey, Jack, you should deserve more viewers. Guys, help me out. Smash that like button, subscribe, retweet it, send it out there. Follow me on Twitter at Jack Murphy Live. Mr. Lynn, thank you very much. I really appreciate it. Hopefully we can have a chance to do this again soon in the future. And until then, best wishes.
Thank you, Jack. Hope so.
And we're out. Thank you very much. I really appreciate it.